On the night of May 25, 1996, Kristen Smart was nearing the end of her first year at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She was 19 years old, outgoing, and known among friends as someone who trusted easily and cared deeply about the people around her. That evening marked Memorial Day weekend, and the campus was filled with students celebrating the close of the academic year. Parties spilled from dorm rooms into nearby streets, and the atmosphere carried the sense of freedom that often comes with the end of exams. Kristen attended an off-campus gathering with friends, unaware that it would be the last time she would be seen alive. As the night progressed, Kristen became visibly intoxicated. Friends later recalled that she was struggling to walk steadily and needed assistance to make her way back toward her dorm. At some point during the early morning hours, she was accompanied by two fellow students, one of whom was Paul Flores, a quiet engineering major who lived in the same dorm complex. Witnesses stated that Flores volunteered to walk Kristen the remaining distance to her residence hall, assuring others that he would make sure she arrived safely. That decision, made casually and without suspicion, would later haunt those who trusted it. Kristen never reached her dorm room. When she failed to appear the next day, concern quickly grew among her friends. Initially, there was hope that she had stayed elsewhere or left campus without informing anyone. That hope faded rapidly as hours turned into days. Her parents were notified, and a missing person report was filed. From the beginning, the case carried a sense of urgency. Kristen had no history of running away, and she had been looking forward to the summer ahead. Her disappearance was sudden, unexplained, and deeply out of character. Law enforcement began interviewing students who had attended the party and those who had seen Kristen that night. Paul Flores emerged early as a person of interest due to his proximity to her during the final moments she was observed. Flores told investigators that he had walked Kristen toward her dorm, but claimed they parted ways before reaching the building. His account placed responsibility back onto circumstances rather than himself. However, inconsistencies in his statements raised questions. Witnesses described seeing Flores and Kristen together closer to his dorm than hers, contradicting his version of events. As investigators searched the campus and surrounding areas, physical evidence was scarce. There were no confirmed sightings after that night and no clear indication of where Kristen might have gone. The absence of evidence made the case difficult to advance, but it also intensified scrutiny on those who had last been with her. Flores's dorm room was searched, and while nothing definitive was found at that time, reports noted unusual odors and disturbances that could not be fully explained. Despite these observations, there was not enough to make an arrest. The investigation soon expanded beyond the campus. Searches were conducted in nearby fields, waterways, and remote locations. Volunteers joined law enforcement, hoping to uncover any trace of Kristen. Her disappearance gained regional attention, and her face appeared on flyers and news broadcasts across California. For her family, the uncertainty was unbearable. Each passing day without answers deepened their fear that something terrible had happened. They held on to the hope that Kristen might still be found alive, even as evidence increasingly suggested otherwise. Paul Flores returned to his parents' home shortly after Kristen vanished. This move, while not illegal, drew further suspicion. His father, Ruben Flores, became part of the investigative focus as well, particularly as years passed without resolution. Over time, witnesses came forward describing troubling behavior by Paul Flores, including prior incidents involving intoxicated women. These accounts, while alarming, did not immediately translate into charges. The case remained stalled, constrained by the lack of physical proof. As the months turned into years, the disappearance of Kristen Smart became one of California's most haunting unsolved cases. Her family refused to let the case fade into obscurity. They organized searches, spoke to the media, and pressured authorities to continue investigating. Each anniversary of her disappearance served as a painful reminder of what remained unresolved. The passage of time did not diminish their determination. Instead, it sharpened it. Behind the scenes, investigators continued to revisit evidence, re-interview witnesses, and examine new leads as technology advanced. Ground-penetrating radar, forensic analysis, and renewed searches brought moments of hope, only to end in frustration. Yet suspicion never drifted far from Paul Flores. His name remained central to the case, even as legal barriers prevented decisive action. For many, the question was not whether a crime had occurred, but whether justice would ever catch up to it. Kristen Smart's disappearance reshaped how campuses approached student safety and accountability. Her case became a cautionary story about trust, vulnerability, and the consequences of moments that seem ordinary at the time. As the investigation quietly continued, one truth remained clear. Kristen did not simply vanish. Something happened to her after she was last seen walking away from that party, and the answers had been waiting far longer than anyone should ever endure. As years passed with no arrest, the investigation into Kristen Smart's disappearance entered a prolonged and painful limbo. Law enforcement faced criticism for early missteps, including delays in securing key areas and the challenge of pursuing a case without a body. Despite these obstacles, detectives continued to monitor Paul Flores, whose behavior over time did little to ease suspicion. He changed residences frequently, struggled to maintain stable employment, and attracted repeated attention from police in unrelated incidents. Each development reinforced concerns, yet none provided the definitive evidence required to move forward legally. Kristen's parents, Denise and Stan Smart, became relentless advocates for their daughter. They refused to accept silence or closure without truth. Through interviews, public appeals, and cooperation with investigators, they kept Kristen's name in the public eye. Their persistence ensured that the case did not fade into obscurity, even as years stretched into decades. The family's efforts also encouraged other witnesses to come forward, some of whom had been hesitant to speak earlier due to fear, uncertainty, or the belief that their information was insignificant. One of the most critical developments in the case emerged through the re-examination of witness statements from the night Kristen vanished. Several individuals reported hearing sounds near Paul Flores's dorm room during the early morning hours, including what they described as unusual activity inconsistent with normal dorm life. At the time, these accounts were not fully pursued. Years later, when reviewed collectively, they suggested a timeline that contradicted Flores's original story. The accumulation of these details began to erode the credibility of his account. Advances in forensic technology also played a significant role in reviving the investigation. Techniques that were unavailable or unreliable in the 1990s became valuable tools decades later. Investigators revisited physical locations associated with Paul Flores, including properties owned by his family. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed to search for disturbances in soil that might indicate concealed remains. These searches were conducted multiple times, reflecting both the difficulty of the terrain and the determination to uncover long-hidden evidence. Throughout this period, Paul Flores continued to deny any involvement in Kristen's disappearance. He maintained that he had done nothing wrong and characterized the scrutiny as harassment. However, prosecutors later argued that his actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt rather than innocence. They pointed to inconsistencies in his statements, his reluctance to cooperate fully with investigators, and the pattern of behavior reported by other women over the years. These factors, while individually circumstantial, collectively painted a troubling picture. The involvement of Paul Flores's father, Ruben Flores, added another layer of complexity to the case. Investigators began to explore the possibility that family members had assisted in concealing evidence. Witnesses described suspicious behavior at properties owned by the Flores family, including areas where soil appeared disturbed shortly after Kristen disappeared. Neighbors recalled unusual nighttime activity and changes to landscaping that seemed abrupt and unexplained. These observations, though made years earlier, gained renewed significance when paired with modern forensic searches. Media attention intensified as the case experienced renewed momentum. Podcasts, documentaries, and investigative reports brought Kristen's story to a new generation. This exposure not only increased public awareness, but also placed pressure on law enforcement to pursue every available lead. The narrative shifted from one of unresolved mystery to one of potential accountability. Public discourse increasingly centered on why it had taken so long for the case to advance, and whether justice delayed could still be justice served. In 2021, after nearly 25 years, prosecutors announced charges against Paul Flores in connection with Kristen Smart's disappearance. The announcement marked a turning point that many had feared would never come. Shortly afterward, Ruben Flores was also charged, accused of helping conceal his daughter's remains. These charges were the culmination of decades of investigation, advocacy, and persistence. They represented both progress and a painful reminder of time lost. The legal process that followed was complex and emotionally charged. Prosecutors presented a case built on circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, and forensic findings. They acknowledged the challenges inherent in prosecuting a case without a recovered body, but argued that the totality of evidence met the burden of proof. The defense countered by highlighting gaps, questioning reliability, and emphasizing the absence of physical remains. The courtroom became the setting where years of suspicion were finally tested. For Kristen's family, the trial was both a moment of hope and a source of renewed grief. They listened as strangers recounted details of their daughter's final night, her vulnerability, and the circumstances that led to her disappearance. Each testimony underscored the reality that Kristen's life had been reduced to evidence and argument. Yet the family remained resolute, believing that truth, however delayed, was worth pursuing. As the trial unfolded, the case moved closer to an outcome that had been deferred for far too long. As the trial reached its final stages, the prosecution sought to bring decades of unanswered questions into a single, coherent conclusion. They argued that while time had passed, the underlying truth had not changed. Kristen Smart had vanished after being last seen in a vulnerable state, accompanied by Paul Flores, and the evidence showed that she never left that encounter alive. Prosecutors emphasized that justice does not expire with time, and that accountability can still be achieved even when answers arrive years later than anyone would wish. Jurors were asked to consider not only what evidence existed, but why certain evidence did not. The absence of Kristen's body was framed not as a mystery, but as the result of deliberate concealment. Prosecutors argued that the lack of remains was itself consistent with the actions of someone attempting to avoid detection. They pointed to testimony regarding soil disturbances, unusual behavior at family properties, and the coordinated actions between Paul Flores and his father. These elements, they said, demonstrated an effort to ensure that Kristen would not be found. The defense maintained that the case relied too heavily on inference and emotion. They argued that memories fade over time and that witness recollections from decades earlier were unreliable. They questioned the interpretation of forensic searches and suggested that investigators had become fixated on one suspect at the expense of other possibilities. The defense stressed that no direct physical evidence linked Paul Flores to a crime scene and urged jurors to focus on reasonable doubt rather than suspicion. Despite these arguments, the prosecution returned repeatedly to the consistency of the narrative that had emerged. Witnesses who had never met one another described similar observations. Behavioral patterns repeated across years and circumstances. Prosecutors argued that coincidence could not reasonably explain the convergence of these details. They reminded jurors that crimes of opportunity often rely on silence, fear, and delay to remain hidden, and that this case exemplified those dynamics. When the verdict was delivered, it marked a defining moment for everyone involved. Paul Flores was found guilty of first-degree murder, bringing a measure of resolution to a case that had spanned more than a quarter century. Ruben Flores was acquitted of charges related to concealing evidence, a decision that reflected the difficulty of proving involvement beyond reasonable doubt. The mixed outcome underscored the complexity of the case and the limits of the legal system in addressing crimes that unfold over long periods of time. For Kristen Smart's family, the verdict represented validation rather than closure. While the conviction affirmed what they had believed for years, it could not restore what had been taken. Kristen's body remained missing, and the circumstances of her final moments were still incomplete. Yet the acknowledgement of responsibility mattered deeply. It affirmed that Kristen's disappearance was not an unresolved mystery, but a crime that had finally been named and judged. The case prompted renewed discussion about campus safety, consent, and accountability. Universities across the country reflected on how they respond to reports of vulnerable students and suspicious behavior. Kristen's disappearance had already influenced changes in policy and awareness, but the trial reinforced the importance of early intervention and thorough investigation. Experts noted that delayed justice often begins with delayed action, and that institutions play a critical role in preventing harm. Kristen Smart's story also highlighted the power of persistence. Without her family's relentless advocacy, the case may never have reached trial. Their refusal to accept inaction demonstrated how public attention and sustained pressure can influence the pursuit of justice. They transformed their grief into purpose, ensuring that Kristen's name remained visible even when progress seemed impossible. Their efforts served as a reminder that victims do not disappear when investigations stall, and that families can become powerful agents of accountability. In the years following the verdict, Kristen's legacy continued to shape conversations about trust and responsibility. Her case became a reference point in discussions about how easily ordinary moments can turn irreversible and how quickly vulnerability can be exploited. It also underscored the importance of listening to those who express concern, even when evidence is incomplete. Kristen's disappearance had been marked by missed opportunities and delayed recognition, lessons that resonate far beyond her story. Although Kristen Smart was never found, her presence remains firmly embedded in the record. Her name is spoken in courtrooms, classrooms, and media coverage as a reminder of what happens when warning signs are overlooked. The conviction affirmed that truth can endure even when evidence is fragmented and time has passed. It reinforced the idea that justice, while imperfect, can still reach those responsible. Kristen Smart was 19 years old when she disappeared, a young woman at the beginning of her life. The years that followed transformed her from a missing person into a symbol of persistence and accountability. While her absence remains a source of pain, the acknowledgement of what happened to her ensures that she is not defined solely by disappearance. Her story stands as a testament to the enduring impact of advocacy, the importance of investigation, and the reality that some truths, no matter how long they remain hidden, will eventually surface.